So, welcome to another episode of the Realist Idealists. Uh, on today's episode, we are going to be discussing kind of recessions and a bit of depression for that matter, but really looking at how these things are impacting our world today, right? In some of our previous episodes, we focused on inflation um, and things like that. And I feel in particular, depending on when you are watching this, you're probably hearing a lot in the news about recessions or an upcoming recession. And yeah, we feel we feel like it's important to get a good understanding of what that really entails and why that should really matter to you. And so, with that being said, uh, we are the Realist Idealists. He's Jordan. I'm Braden, and this is Powerview. So, like the intro already explained, we're going to be discussing recession/depressions, and I feel like the easiest place to start, of course, is what is a recession/what is a depression? Because even Jordan, you and I were talking. Well, I guess it was the other day now, but in kind of preparation for this episode, just wrapping our heads around what it really means to have a recession versus a depression, right? I feel like when it comes to depressions, everyone or most people have heard at least of the Great Depression, right?
Yeah.
That obviously is a a pretty major.
Almost 100 years ago. It's crazy.
I know, right? Crazy.
Yeah.
But yeah, from an economic standpoint, everyone's heard of that. You see the imagery of people waiting in lines to
bread banks.
Right. So it's a very stark, dreadful type of experience, or at least that's what the imagery of it is. And then we also have things like recessions, which happen a lot more, they happen a lot more often and a lot more common in our economic systems. And of course, you can have recessions that are local, no different than depressions, I guess. But then you also tend to have global versions of this. And I guess not to jump too far ahead, but I feel like a real reason why you have kind of global versions of recessions and depressions is because it tends to be the kind of economic powerhouses of our world, right? So whether it be the United States or the United Kingdom or France or Germany or countries like that are big players. I mean, China and Russia, they all kind of play into those same situations where they're big players on the kind of economic trade front. And so when those economies have a bit of a we'll call it a hiccup.
It could be for so many, 6 degrees of separation.
Yeah,
Kind
right.
of has that impact where it's like one country has a bunch of failed crops and a bunch of other countries are relying on that country's wheat.
100%.
Their recession now becomes it's like
that domino effect.
I was just say trickle down effect because capitalism is supposed to have the right. So it works like can be bad or good in certain ways.
Yeah, right. Sometimes, like, that's a good point. It kind of leaves some opportunities for other countries to step in. But as a whole, right, if you are a major country that trades a lot, whether they're buying a lot of goods or selling a lot of goods, and then all of a sudden that has to kind of take a back seat and maybe slow down or completely halt, well, that's going to affect things, right? So, with that being said, jumping back right into it, what's a recession? What's a depression, right? A lot of times, I think actually you and I were talking about it, and this is where a lot of this was coming from, is how the 2008 recession is now called the Great Recession. Right? It's kind of coined that term.
And I'm old, so I take longer to catch on to new phrases.
Yeah.
So we're already calling it that, eh?
Yeah, right? Yeah. So it's kind of, I feel like that name is somewhat taken hold for a little bit now, but it's very much so like a bit of a glorification of it, right? The Great Depression, the Great Recession. And of course, as you can imagine, those are just extreme examples of either a recession or a depression. So in the case of a recession, you're really looking at, well, actually, sorry, backtracking. In the case of both recessions and depressions, you're looking at GDP, right? Gross domestic product. And for those of you, because I don't know if we've necessarily talked about that term, but for those of you who are unaware of what that is, GDP is essentially kind of the goods and services that are sold or, sold within your country in a given period of time, right?
Yeah, fiscal year or whatever.
Yeah, right. And essentially, that's kind of the revenue of a country is kind of a way to look at it. It's not exactly like that, but
it's like an indicator, I guess,
it's
right?
the things that, whatever, if it's Canada, the things that they're able to produce, right? So a lot of times GDP is looked at in the same way as the economy, but there's kind of nuances to that, like everything in economics. But nevertheless, that's a kind of an easy way to think about it, right? As GDP is doing well, then the economy is doing well. You'll hear that all the time in the news or whatever. So yeah, in the case of a recession, you're really looking at a decrease in the GDP, right? It's not always that it's a super like heavy amount, like a severe drop or anything like that. But regardless, it's if last month we were able to have X amount of dollars worth of
goods
in our GDP growth,
yeah.
Now we have kind of gone less. We've gone backwards. So we've had a shrinking in our economy, right?
Yeah.
You often hear that.
You're
as well.
producing less than you were before, in a sense, right?
So it's and so it could be one of two things, right? It could be either that you're producing less, or just in general, people are buying less.
Yeah.
Right. And that in our globalized world, of course, that doesn't even have to be simply domestically, right? It could be, oh, we're not selling such and such to this country anymore, right? Like if there's an issue with the United States or China or any country like that
on a certain good,
yeah, right. If we normally export this to them and they now don't need it, well, that's obviously going to be a shrinkage and a slowdown in our economy, right?
Yeah, we've all seen wheat prices go up because of the war in Ukraine, right? We're actually one of the larger wheat producers ourselves too. So even though we produce a lot of our own wheat too, but we see the price because there's more demand for our wheat now to compensate for the amount that's not coming out of where it used to come out of.
And that's like kind of a bit of an ironic situation because in that situation, that would actually grow our GDP because the demand for our wheat would go up because whatever Ukraine can't export the same amount that they were already doing, and globally the demand is still going to be there, right? So, yeah, it's a decrease in GDP, and then specifically with recessions, you're looking at okay, well, so I guess a little bit backtracking, like GDP is kind of calculated based off of quarters, so basically a quarter of a year. It follows typically the business schedule, so it's not literally like January to December. Anyone who like you would know this from working at your job, right? Like your quarterly stuff is not necessarily it doesn't fall within 1 year type of thing, but nevertheless it's calculated by if there is a decrease in the economy for 2 quarters straight, so essentially half a year, that is considered a recession. Right?
Where if the prices are not going up but going down on like certain commodities.
Yeah, so it doesn't actually, like, just to clarify, it doesn't have to do with prices of goods. It has to do with like I know this is going to sound funny, but it has to do with like the revenue of a country.
Sorry,
right?
Yeah, it's the more the people are spending. Sorry, so like if people are spending nothing, like the longer that goes on, that people are struggling, right? So
yeah. So if you used to sell X amount of I don't know, cars, and now we're having less cars being bought and sold, right? That
Yeah.
would be a slowdown. So you might have produced the same amount, but you weren't able to actually realize those gains, if that makes sense, right? Because
Yeah.
no one's actually buying that car or buying that wheat or whatever it may be, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, the 2 quarters aspect, that's like a big indicator for a recession. In the case of a depression, one, it tends to be a lot more severe of a drop, right?
Yeah. Quickly
Um,
too, a lot faster as well. It's not
yeah,
as
yeah,
gradual.
not as
Yeah.
gradual. Um, it's a significant, like, oh my goodness,
Yeah, it's
our
the
economy was
difference of
here and
like
now it's
skiing
dropped.
between like a black diamond and like a blue hill kind
Yeah,
of thing. Where it's
yeah,
like you're
yeah, yeah.
the
You just all
depression,
of a
you're just
sudden you're
gonna
like, oh, we're
fall.
on
Yeah,
moguls, right? Like,
yeah,
it's gonna be a bumpy ride.
yeah,
Um, but kind of similar to that 2 quarter aspect for a recession, a depression also has to last for at least a year, if not more, right? So
longer.
you could have a situation, um, hmm, like uh, potentially with the pandemic, right? Where that, like, you could have for 1 quarter a massive drop in an economy, right? Because
Yeah,
the economy was just frozen. But
yeah,
then that next quarter, the government goes and boosts the economy through government spending or printing of money, and essentially you're able to keep things afloat. And then all of a sudden, okay, we're back to where we were before, right? So
yeah.
it really has to be that not only is that severe drop happening, but it's kind of maintaining that severe drop.
It's staying there.
Um,
Yeah.
so it might not drop further, but it's not rising back up at least,
No,
right?
and like to your point, like during the Great Depression, it was why it lasted so. It's like unemployment stayed down for so long. Like it was below. It was like more than ten
Yeah.
percent for like 5 years.
Yeah. And that's just it, right? Like
Yeah,
it really is like with a depression, even more so than a recession, you're seeing the like job loss, you're seeing companies going under, you're seeing uh luxury goods kind of being somewhat obsolete in terms of being
yeah.
purchased.
Pulled off the
Um,
shelf. Yeah,
yeah, right. Like it's a very dramatic situation, which you could argue, especially whether it be 2008 or some of the other recessions that we've had over the past however many decades, um, that if it wasn't for governments stepping in, we could have seen depressions, right?
yeah.
Um, Potentially jumping a little bit here with the 2008 financial crisis, um, because that was a failure within the banking system, mainly in the United States, but the kind of domino effect from there.
Sure,
Uh,
yeah. Felt
if
rippled through
if
the
it
rest
was
of the world's economies.
yeah, felt through kind of literally every economy. But if it wasn't for kind of government bailouts of those banks, and if
Yeah,
they just let those banks fully fail, you easily could have seen a depression come out of that, right? Because that chain reaction, of course, as we know from our previous episodes, banking and the banking system really is the backbone of every
yeah.
economy, like
Because of the
bar
more
none.
bank runs they do, the bigger problems you're gonna have.
100%, right? And
Yeah,
just also, if people don't have money, right? People don't have means of exchange. People don't have,
exchange. Yeah,
right? All those things are going to play into it, right? So yeah, you kind of hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of just the generic aspect of what's a recession, what's a depression. Really, you can look at it as one's just a bigger deal than the other, right? One's a more
yeah,
severe, significant drop. One's going to uh, they're both going to have job loss, but one's going to be exponentially greater in that job loss. It
job
might not
loss.
be limited to a certain sector, right? How I mentioned 2008, it
Yeah,
was not
financial.
mainly,
Yeah,
but yeah, I guess
for the
mainly
most part. Yeah,
is financial, right? Um, in other recessions that we've had, maybe you're seeing it in the energy industry or um, a bit of like the .com bubble when that
yes, yeah,
burst, right? That like kind of the massive layoffs that you saw, and
yeah. Because there was
obviously,
also the panic before we were really young. Was Y2K.
hmm
There
yep,
was a big panic there as well. But
yeah,
that was again more like a recession, where it's just kind of like it was a short term fear, not a long term reality.
hmm
If that makes sense.
yeah. And so I think kind of going off that, you're seeing that there are multiple different reasons for why a recession or a depression can happen. Um, I do apologize ahead of time because I am seeing every so often my my video is skipping quite a bit.
Oh, is it on your end?
Yeah, it's because it's on Wi-Fi. I need to
Oh, okay.
get
It
a
looks
cable
it's
for it.
coming through smooth through my
It's coming
thing.
through now, fine, but
Yeah.
on occasion I'll see it jump. Nevertheless, um, yeah, there's lots of different reasons because our economies are pretty diverse, right? There's a lot of different industries that make up an economy,
Yeah.
and
They contribute to the overall GDP and everything like that.
yeah,
Yeah.
right.
There's different
So,
sectors. Yeah.
and obviously, the bigger the sector is, like something like financials or energy or whatever, right? Um, the larger the potential impact or like kind of larger domino if there's an issue within those industries, the effect gets like spread out that much further, right?
Yeah.
um and so if you have a situation where whatever industry gets disrupted to an extreme, of course,
Depending. Yeah.
yeah, depending on what's the scenario is. Of course, that's going to affect spending in all other industries, right? So if you have a banking issue, or you have an energy issue, or you have a certain manufacturing issue, um, those are then going to affect even just like, okay, I want to go to the grocery store. Well, I don't have the money to do that. Or I want to go take a trip somewhere, right? Like, so hotels and stuff like that. Oh, I can't do that. Or I want to go
Yeah.
buy new clothes or a new TV. Well, I can't go and do that because that money is not available for me
Available.
to go and purchase those things, right?
Yeah. You got to spend it
Um,
on your
or at least
necessities.
for the average person. Sorry, what were you
Yeah.
saying there?
No, it's just because it's already designated for your necessities in that sense, right?
Yeah, right. Because it's as a whole, when you have an economic slowdown, businesses will kind of reflect that pain on
Onto their,
everything, right?
yes, your
Whether
raises
like
become not as big,
yeah, right, or your
right? Yeah.
raises,
They
or you
might
might
cut
even
your
be let
hours.
go.
Yeah.
Yeah, cut your hours, right? And then that has obviously a domino effect. It's kind of funny. So I guess that leads maybe again my typical self of jumping from one thing to the next. But um, when you have a recession or a depression, they somewhat become a self-fulfilling
Prophecy.
situation, right?
Yeah.
Because if I'm a business and we're going into recession and therefore less people are spending money on my products, let's say, right? Even if
Yeah.
my industry is not the industry that was the initial
But
problem,
it's now
let's just say.
filtered down. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So no one from that industry is spending money at my store, right? So let's say, for argument's sake, Jordan, you're my employee. I now cut your hours, right? Or I
Yeah.
let you go, maybe even. Now, you on top of that are another person who's not spending money in the economy,
Correct.
right? So it's ironic because in a economic downturn like a recession or in extreme examples of a depression, we often become uh uh oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the word. um like, what's it called?
Okay.
Austerity,
Oh,
right?
okay. Okay. Okay.
So
Yeah.
essentially, basically, you're taking austerity measures, which means from a government standpoint, you are not going to put a bunch of money into the system,
Yeah.
right?
It's gonna
Because
stay
it's
with
like,
you
oh,
more
we
likely.
gotta,
Yeah.
like, the economy is kind of slowing down. We don't have the money to justify it. But the ironic part of that is that the only way to get out of a recession is to
Is to
spend more
stimulate the
money.
economy. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So that's why it becomes a little bit more of a self fulfilling situation where, uh, whether it be the government or businesses themselves,
Or whoever.
when they're not putting money into the economy or into their employees or right whatever you're looking at.
Into their growth and development. Yeah.
Yeah, right. No one's doing infrastructure projects during a recession, right?
Yeah.
Because it's like, oh, we're barely
It's
staying
part of
afloat.
budget cuts. Yeah.
Yeah, because of course, when your GDP goes down, your taxes also go down, right? When
Correct. Yeah.
your GDP goes down, that means in general people are spending less,
Yeah.
right? Because
Because
that's why
technically
the
you can't.
GDP went
Yeah.
down, right? Um, and so even kind of, I guess, leading maybe to a bit of the modern context of this, but um, when you hear on the news or on YouTube or a podcast or in the newspaper, whatever it is that you kind of get information from, people talking about, oh, a recession is coming. Um, like you got to find a way to shelter your money and save up because you don't know if money's going to be coming come next
Yeah.
year or whatever in a next month. Um, that self-fulfilling aspect of let's hoard our money, hoard our resources,
Leads to,
because I
yeah.
don't know what's happening tomorrow, right? um yeah, like what you're about to say, it leads to kind of allowing that recession to
Yeah,
come
maybe
about.
not directly, but it definitely, like, it speeds the
Yeah,
process up for sure,
right,
right? So,
yeah,
like, it's one of those things that
yeah, yeah, like if you have, obviously, if a major industry starts failing, that's the ultimate cause of a recession, let's say,
yes, yeah.
right?
And like you're
But it
saying,
only makes it
housing,
worse when you also start saving or like kind of hoarding your money because, okay, I don't know if
yeah,
the uncertainty of things, or maybe you made an investment into that industry and now obviously it's not worth anything or worth a lot less.
less, yeah,
So you can't, the comfortability of being able to spend your money um, on
goes
all
out the
levels of
window.
things, whether it be
Yeah,
an individual or government, really goes out the window, right? Because it's
yeah.
like, okay, can we actually justify going on that vacation, or can we actually justify upgrading
Building
those
that
roads, right?
school,
Like,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, building that school, whatever it may be. Um, so yeah, it is a a bit of an interesting concept within our economic systems. Um, and it's something that I like to note that not necessarily full out depressions, but you could make this argument that depressions fall into this category as well. But at least recessions are, when you look historically at it, uh, the argument would be that they are a part of our economic systems, right?
Yes, it's
It's
part of the
not
cycle of,
necessarily that um, they're a fluke thing, right? Like that's like, oh my goodness, how could this have happened, right? Um,
it's part of the
ec-
cycle, yeah.
yeah, right. Economic downturns tend to be a part of the cycle, and a big reason for that is some of the things that we've already previously talked about, especially when it comes to banking. Um, that like when things are good, it's just like, all right, full steam ahead. And then it's not until we realize that,
We've gone too far, yeah.
yeah, yeah, we've overinflated the system, that it's like, oh, something's got to come crashing down, right?
Yeah,
Because we didn't go with scale, right? The whole aspect of, especially in a capitalist system, right? Um, your economy is growing, or the resources being put into the economy are greater than the actual economy
output,
itself.
yeah, you're putting more in than you're getting out,
Yeah,
yeah.
because the idea is that in the future, it's going to, you're
Gonna
going to
click,
justify that, right? Like because it's like, oh, we grew whatever this
yeah,
these
it's a passive
infrastructure
investment,
things, or
yeah.
yeah, because at the end of the day, if you want to build a bridge, well, you have to pay for
Yeah.
that bridge before the bridge is
Yes.
ever
Oh
built,
yeah, because
right?
you and I have joked privately, like, oh, well, I would like all one government would have to do in Canada is just build an oil refinery.
Yeah, yeah,
I
right.
know
Like
it's
it.
expensive, but it's a long term investment.
Yes, yeah, yeah. It's. I feel like because it's such a dirty business, not to go down
People
the
get,
oil refinery
yeah, no, 100%. But yeah,
conversation,
it's
but because it's such a
people
dirty
tiptoe
business, we're
around it.
like, oh, we'll just ship it to other countries.
Yeah.
But you're missing out on a lot of profit, right? Like
Well, yeah, and it's
when,
not only that too. Now it's like, well, Nigeria's got oil, but they're using child labor.
yeah, yeah,
And it's like you could be preventing that by just providing our oil to all these people and have it
yep,
done properly. But
yeah, yeah,
there's an
yeah.
investment that has to
Ethically
be made
sourced
first. Yes, yeah, like, there you go. Yeah,
materials, right, or resources.
yeah, or at least a
100%.
little bit
There's
more.
lots
Like,
of things with that.
yeah,
Yeah. No, that's such a good point. Because yeah, there is so many different factors that kind of play into it. Um, but as a whole, it's like, yeah, we're trying to grow the economy year over year, right? You never want
yeah,
to even be stagnant, right? That's one of the big things, especially anyone who works in like the business field
yeah.
of like
Constantly
retail
want to
or
see
things like
some
that.
kind of, yeah,
Yeah, it's like, well, we did well last like quarter, but we need to increase it, right? Like, so if you were up 25% last
you got to
quarter,
be
it's
at
like
like
we're not
27.
just
Yeah,
staying there, we're keeping
yeah,
it rolling, right? Like, so
yeah,
get another whatever 25% um increase. So
yeah.
yeah, it's the capitalist machine, so to speak, right? The
Exactly.
economic machine um is all about deploying capital so that you can get a return on investment, right?
ROI. Yeah,
And then when that has it takes a downturn, uh, that's when you see recessions and depressions come about,
yeah,
right? So, somewhat shifting things here, um, trying to look at the modern context because Jordan and I were talking about this, and I said before the episode, as much as we could what other I've mentioned it a few times, obviously the 2008 financial
yeah,
crisis, global financial crisis, right? We could have a huge conversation about that, but one, I think that there's tons of content out there that already
yeah,
goes over that. um, if you want to watch The Big Short, shout out
yeah. That's
to
a
that
great
movie,
movie,
right? Like
actually.
that's a
Yeah, yeah.
big one. uh
But to your point too, there was like recessions in the '80s and the '90s. Like
yeah,
just
right,
because it
like so
wasn't
there's
our time
so
doesn't mean it
many.
wasn't happening, right?
100%.
Yeah,
Yeah. Right? So because there are so many and they all have different reasons for why they caused a recession, right? Energy, uh, like issues with the dollar, um,
yeah,
banking, right? Go down the list. There's lots of different examples of it, right? Obviously, the Great Depression has to do with too much leverage, like margin in the stock market, which is
market.
essentially
Yeah,
like people buying stocks on credit rather than like cold hard cash. Um, so
excuse me.
yeah, nevertheless, there's lots of different reasons for why these things happen.
Happened. Yeah,
Um, and so as much as we could go into those, I think it's more important that you have a base understanding that, okay, I know what the general aspect of a recession is: the economy shrinking, right? A depression is the economy shrinking severely and for a longer time, right? Um,
yeah,
Now, with all this talk in media, government, whatever, around a potential upcoming recession, which I feel like often gets the like, oh, doom and gloom. Like you could probably say that for the last 5 years, people have been calling a recession, right?
yeah.
Even prior to the pandemic. Um,
Oh yeah,
it it's important to understand, I think, our modern or our current situation because it's very different in a lot of ways than any other recession or depression, I guess, for that matter, that we've had previously, right? And
yeah,
a big part of that, of course, is the pandemic, right?
yeah,
And the economic policies that occurred during those kind of 2 to 3 years, right?
yeah.
Um, in a nutshell,
Combination of things. Yeah,
yeah, it's a combination of things. But in a nutshell, we are potentially moving into a recession where it will be a fully employed recession.
correct. Yeah, it's not going to because of job loss.
Yeah. And so the reason for that is so yeah, like you're going to have tons of people still like unemployment right now is in a lot of countries at least are kind of in like an all time not all time low, but there are
It's
lower
not. It's not
rates.
terrible. Like
Yeah,
on
most people
paper.
in
Yeah,
Canada, for instance, are employed, right? If you want to be employed, you can find a job out there, right? In fact, there is like, I forget what if this statistic has like an actual name or something like that, but the amount of like vacant jobs that are in the
Yeah.
market, right, I think is at a relatively high rate. That there's a lot of people or businesses that are like, hey, we're trying to hire someone, right? Which is obviously normally a sign of a strong economy, right? We're hiring people, unemployment is low, meaning that more people have money, right? So on and so forth, right? That is the complete opposite of just about any other recession that we've had,
Yeah.
at least as far as I'm aware. Um, and I guess the kind of nuance with that is that we're going to go into a recession because of I feel like this is a big buzzword, and we've already even had an episode kind of about it. But inflation is the reason why a recession should at least happen, right?
Yeah.
Um, so
And
you're
like
going
you
to
were
have a
saying,
situation
there's
where, sorry, yep, what were we saying?
oh, but like even to like the inflation, there's like factors. It's not just COVID that added into it. There's a few,
Yeah, I mean,
right? Like
you could make the argument that even prior to COVID, uh,
it
the
was
risk of inflation
was
was
there.
at a relatively high
Yeah.
rate.
Yeah.
Um,
This
a
just
lot of
pushed it
people
over
have been borrowing a lot of money over the past whatever.
5, 6 years. Yeah.
Well, yeah, even longer than that, like
Yeah.
going back to whatever 2014 type of thing. Right? I think that was the last time we had a bit of a recession, if I remember
Yeah.
correctly. Um, but yeah, so you can make the argument that that's been the case. Um, the pandemic, of course, put gasoline to the flame, right?
Yeah.
You hear a lot about this. We obviously talked about it. But when you're printing a lot of money and putting that into the system, of course, that's going to mean that prices are going to go up over time, right? In our case, it felt probably overnight. Which arguably it did, because we had a bit of a situation, especially when you talk about like 2020, even
Yeah.
2021 to a certain degree, that when you had all these lockdowns and things of that nature, people weren't going out and spending money, right?
Yeah.
Even if they still had a job or if they were getting government subsidies. Um,
Yeah, because there was too much
or
uncertainty, right? So
yeah, and just also like there's only so much you can do, right? Like if you weren't
everything's
taking a trip,
closed.
you weren't
Yeah.
yeah, like if you couldn't get to that store around the
There was
corner
nowhere to go
because
spend money. Yeah.
yeah, right? Like maybe you were only doing online shopping and therefore um you just I don't know, like when you were out at stores, you were more likely to pick up things and that you're like, "Oh, I wasn't going to buy that, but
Yeah.
sure, I
Now
see
you
it and it's
stop and
on a
think
good
about it.
deal and I'll buy it,"
Yeah.
right? As opposed to when you're shopping online, you're probably going for a specific thing, right? You're like, oh, I need a new jacket. I don't know, right?
Yeah.
That's your kind of. I went onto this website because I want to get this jacket, and then that's it. So yeah, it's a very different scenario when you have a lot of money still being put into the system, but what we're seeing now, kind of with the results of inflation, and of course, we've talked about with interest rates and all that kind of stuff. So if you haven't watched that episode, of course, go look at it and you'll get a better sense. But the GDP, right, the gross domestic product, is shrinking because our dollars are not worth the same.
Yeah, because
So
people
you
aren't
might
spending
have the
it.
same dollar value, so to speak, or not dollar value, but the dollar quantity, I guess. I don't know
Like the
if that
volume
makes
of
sense, right? Like,
like the
yeah,
GDP, yeah, is the
yeah.
same, but for some, like, because we were saying earlier, like usually your GDP is your indicator,
Hmm.
and in this
Yeah.
case, it still kind of is, but it's not as obvious in that sense because, like you're saying, right, it's like almost a fully employed recession where people are working, but the cost of commodities have gone up so much that even though people are
Yes.
employed, you have to second guess now.
Yeah. Cause and I think on top of that, you have a situation that like for you and I, or really anyone, but um for the average person, if the price to like a big one, obviously we always talk about is groceries have gone up in price, or
Yeah,
but even
gas.
look at luxury goods and stuff like that. If the price of these goods have gone up, I'm now rethinking of whether or not I want to actually buy
Actually
it.
buy it.
Right?
Yep.
I might even have a situation where I physically do have the dollars for it, but if
you're
I'm going to
trying to,
buy
yeah.
that plus all these other things, well, now it's like,
The
okay,
utility
I'm
becomes a bigger factor, right? It's like, am I
yeah,
actually going to use it?
yeah, right, and that is kind of again, I guess maybe kind of relating back to our banking and currency episodes, but currency at the end of the day is just a tool to purchase those goods, right?
Goods. Yeah.
So uh your purchasing power as a whole really comes into question when the prices of goods go up, right? And there, or maybe you have some job uncertainty or um, whatnot, right? Like,
Yeah.
so you may have more physical dollars in your kind of bank account,
But
but
based
that
on the current
spending,
trending of things, yeah, it's like, well, if the gas is gonna like even just little things where it's like if you have a trip
yep,
like 3 months down the road, it's like, oh, it's like a 5 hour drive or something, and gas is like $2 a liter now. It's
yeah,
like, well, in
yeah,
between now and
plays
that
a
trip,
plays
I'm
a
not going to be doing as
huge
much.
part of
Yeah,
that,
yeah,
right? Um, because I feel like that's such a good one, like gas in particular, right? We've
because
uh,
you got to work.
you
It's
could
kind
make
of
the
like
argument that it isn't even necessarily to do with inflation fully, but the supply of gas
correct. Yeah, because
has really shrunk
we've had to go to
globally.
different places. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
you can't
Yeah,
get it from certain places anymore, so it's very
yeah, right. And so because of that, the cost of oil and natural gas and all that kind of stuff has gone up,
goes up.
and
Yeah,
therefore, when you're talking about like gasoline, like so oil, um, the price at the pump has jumped up. So now I'm rethinking the fact of like, okay, well, to fill up a tank, it went up by $20, or
do I really
that
need
might
to
be an
go
extreme,
here
but
and do this? Yeah,
yeah,
if
right,
I'm
like,
already going here to do this.
yeah, right, like,
Yeah,
so you're having to rethink how you're spending your money, and that's very different to have a situation where you're rethinking how you spend your money, but you're still employed, or you maybe even got a raise at your job,
yeah,
or right,
exactly.
like,
Well, yeah, and it's like, yeah, that's the thing, right? It's like you already got a raise, but you're still like budgeting the same way.
yes, yeah, especially if you looked at like 2022 in particular,
Yeah, I was
when
gonna
you were
say,
seeing inflation rates of 11% and stuff like
yeah,
that.
but your
Well, no one's
raise,
getting a raise of 11%,
yeah,
right?
your
Like,
raise is still sitting around 5 if you're lucky.
if you're lucky sometimes.
If
I
you're
think a lot
lucky,
of
yeah,
people, like,
don't get
for
that.
me
Like
in the
it's like
public
2%
sector, I'm
usually.
like, yeah, stuck at like at 2%. If not, I think the government even tried a lot of public sector jobs to limit to 1%, right?
Yeah,
Like our government in Ontario.
yeah,
Um, Now, that might have been even technically before the pandemic, but nevertheless, you're still dealing with that same kind of repercussions of, hey, the cost of goods have gone up 11%. I only got an increase of wage of 1 to
yeah.
2%. That's a net loss of whatever,
Of
9%,
wages, yeah.
uh, depending on things. So, yeah, 9% less things can be purchased by me. And so, from a GDP standpoint, the justification for producing more products goes out the window,
Window,
because if
yeah,
people aren't buying it, then like there's no reason to produce it, right?
exactly.
Um,
No demand, no production.
yeah, right. That basic supply and demand conversation, right?
Yeah,
Um, and so yeah, we are in an interesting situation with our potential, right? We're not. I think technically speaking, um, though we haven't felt the effects like kind of job loss and all of that kind of stuff.
that's
Um,
the telltale signs. Yeah,
yeah, I think if I remember correctly, I mean, I could obviously look it up right now to look at our GDP numbers in Canada in particular. Um, but we potentially actually might already be in a
be in a
recession.
recession. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, I
Um,
would be by the traditional standards. I think we would be
yeah, based off of that GDP growth being
Correct.
less
Yeah.
and 2 quarters, all that
But I
kind of
think
stuff.
to like your point too is that the unemployment hasn't slipped yet, so that's why they haven't
Yeah,
really.
so we're not fully feeling it because it's
Yeah,
like, well,
but in all
there's people
intents and
buying.
cases, yeah,
Yeah.
it's like
Yeah.
most people have cut back on their grocery budgets, and like the
Yeah.
fact that Dollarama stocks are now going up 2 years in a row should be an indicator that if
Yeah.
people are
Yeah.
switching to the dollar store to buy stuff,
And I think
that should be a
actually
sign.
that's a huge, not to cut you off, but you
No,
like
no,
kind of
no. Yeah,
sparked
that was pretty
the
much the
thing
end
in
of my
my.
thought.
Okay, perfect. But that is such an important part because
Sorry.
no worries. From a corporate side of things, so businesses, there are a lot of business industries that have all-time high profits, right? A big
Yeah,
conversation,
grocery
and
stores. Yeah,
especially, yeah, it's grocery stores, 100%. Um, that when you have businesses still maintaining profits, if not growing their profits, you are justifying kind of more money going in on the stock market, right? Like, because you're like, okay, well, this company is growing.
doing good.
Um,
Yeah,
you have more justification from those industries, like obviously not to pick on the grocery stores, but if it is a grocery store chain that is getting all-time high profits, well, maybe they're now going to invest in building another grocery store or what
yeah.
have you, right? um, so from the economic machine aspect, people are able to kind of keep it rolling, even though
Regardless,
from more
yeah,
of an individual side of things,
it's definitely
we
tougher
are
day to day.
starting to
Yeah,
limit things. Yeah.
yeah,
Right. Like you're thinking about how you're spending your money a lot more than when times were good, so to speak.
yeah.
Right.
And I think for
Um,
most people, if like they're listening to this and you're working a full time job, like, and you've gone out anywhere in the last 12 months, you'll notice you'll yeah, you don't have to be. This is like almost everybody's can notice this.
yeah. I think if you're an average person who is kind of still with reality in terms of an economic situation, yeah, to your point, you should 100% realize that
Or
this
felt
is,
it somewhere. Like, yeah, you
yeah,
might
right. Maybe
reschedule
you're
this
not
year.
like you're still whatever, you're still going to the grocery store and buying like things. You're not saying, oh, okay, I can't buy, I don't know,
Yeah,
steak,
beef. Like no one's biting steak.
but
Yeah, okay, yeah.
but you're you're having to justify these things a little bit more, right? And that's how
Yeah.
you start to feel a little bit of that,
Sting. Yeah.
yeah, from an economy standpoint. But the economy is so much larger that maybe you're still spending money at the grocery store, but you're not going out and, I don't know, buying a Sea-Doo, right?
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
or buying a new car, or I
Five
don't know,
thousand
some
dollar
of those things
TV.
that are more
Yeah.
luxury
Yeah.
in nature. That's where you start to see things get chipped away from an earlier standpoint, um, in the course of like kind of an economic downturn, right? The extreme examples, like a depression, is where even your bare necessities, right, like food, clothing, shelter, that when those things you're like,
Unattainable
I
for
can't even
yeah.
afford that, that's when
Yeah.
you're really in that severe drop
And
to
you hit like scary unemployment, like you're talking like
yeah,
15
yeah,
percent and up of the population.
right.
Yeah.
And I feel like the even kind of going off of that, we now are in a way more complex world that, um again, we've already talked about how, or not necessarily on the podcast, but we've talked in general about doing an episode on the housing situation, housing
Yeah.
market, and all that kind of stuff. Um, you can have a situation where you're employed, but you have no place to live,
Live. Yeah.
right? Which is a interesting kind of similar situation where you have, um, what's it called, like an economic, um
Bubble in a
recession
way.
or what,
It's
yeah, like a bubble like that,
yeah.
but yet you're still employed, you're still getting a wage, you're still right, like all of those things haven't been completely, uh those typical markers
Iron
of job loss are not
aren't there.
necessarily there. Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
right. And
It's
so
a very different, like you said, like unlike before, like it's much different this time
yeah, right, like
because
previously it's like, oh, this industry failed, well, that's why there's a domino effect, as opposed to some of the recessions or the things that we're kind of getting into nowadays, and you can make the argument of even in like 2014 or whatever it was, it's a similar situation that um, it's not your typical financial results, if that makes sense, that are
Yeah.
causing these
The normal
things.
indicating trends are normally like they're not out of alignment to way that we would expect them to be, kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it's kind of like almost misleading in the sense where it's like, no, everything seems to be good.
Yeah.
Right? But it's
That's
like in
so,
reality, you go down to the guy making like $45,000, like, buddy, I'm dying over here. Like,
yeah. You're like, when you're making $45,000 and you're poor kind of
yeah,
thing, right?
yeah.
Like that's not, I mean, obviously that's not like a crazy salary, right?
No,
Especially in
but you,
Canada. Obviously,
well,
in
in
the United
Canada,
States,
but
the average, I
if,
think, wage is like
forget the
$50,000.
United
But
States. If you make like,
yeah,
I think it's like $32,000, you're the top percent of like 1% earners in the entire human race.
yeah, right, yeah,
Like,
which is wild, but it's
we
all
think it's
relative,
busy.
right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah. So you have this kind of false sense of security, right? Where you feel like your economic situation should be a lot better than it
better.
is.
Yeah,
Um, because it's not like you have no money, right? If you had to go buy some food, you can buy some food. If you had to
you've got your way to make it
live
through the
somewhere.
year. Like, it's just
Hmm.
the three major things, which is food, shelter, I guess water, but transportation, right? In modern society
Yeah.
have
Oh
all been
yeah. Yeah.
affected in proportionally. And I think that's the thing, like the major, like kind of thing to look at is the kind of like the necessity, like the three necessities, and like
Yeah. Hmm.
what's the cost on those. Like housing's out of control.
Yeah.
Groceries recently, only in the last like year or two, have really gone up because that's a lot more recent. The housing has kind of been like a little bit more over a decade or so, kind of
Hmm.
trending that way, whereas
Yeah.
like no one saw the food prices coming like this.
Yeah.
And I think the gas, to a degree, was kind of like somewhere of a case study of in between
Yeah.
of
It's like
those two.
creeping up, but yeah, we're like, is this like, are we fully in this situation? Like
Yeah,
even not to go into like the war in Ukraine type of situation, but it wasn't like we automatically felt the burn of that living in North
exactly. But
America,
now it's been
right?
like almost 2 years, and it's
Hmm. Yeah.
like you're saying earlier, like the domino effect ripples down, like ripples, like the currents ripple down, and you feel it, whether it's right away or the impact's a little bit takes longer to
Yeah.
get to you. It's still going to kind of shake things up a bit, right?
Hmm. Yeah. It's that having an inflationary recession in particular, right? Like that is um because you have like, I guess like to kind of backtrack a little bit. I had mentioned earlier that one of the best ways to get out of a recession is by spending more money, right?
Yeah.
When you have an inflationary
Then it
recession,
becomes a little trickier, yeah,
yeah, right? Because
because the last thing you want to do
you
is print more money too. Like it's just, yeah, it's this whole
hmm. Right? Because you
vicious
have a
cycle.
situation where you can have one of two things, right? If you want to get out of a recession, you either have to not spend any money, right? And then therefore the prices of goods can go down, but then people still have like obviously they're whatever, they're getting paid from their jobs and there's a lot of money in the system because inflation was
Yeah,
an issue um, from a printing of dollars standpoint. Um, so you have that scenario where it's like the supply and demand. You remove the demand, therefore the prices can kind of uh,
rebound.
yeah rebound accordingly, so that you can
Yeah,
start buying again. Or you have a situation where you're almost going to accept that um, if you want to buy a liter of gas, it costs you $1.70. Or if you want to buy a can of tuna and it costs you, I don't know, 2.50, $3, right? Like,
yeah,
which
which,
feels astronomical.
yeah,
But if you have that situation where I'm going to actually print even more money, but putting it into um, certain um, what's the word I'm trying to look for, but not industries, but like certain means of getting that money into the economy, where it's not just simply going into the stock market or going into something that's not producing anything, right?
Yeah.
Like if I give you money and it's like, this is specifically for your grocery bill, right?
Yeah, you can't guarantee that that's how it's going to get spent. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you could do, for instance, like tax rebates, right?
Yeah.
So if you are able to submit at the end of the year your grocery bill, and let's say it's, I don't know, $30,000, right?
Yeah.
And then the government is saying, okay, we will actually cover half of that, right? So
They
that's
can,
a way where we directly manipulated the system where it's like, in theory, the government is kind of printing more money, but it went to kind of covering your grocery bill, right?
yeah.
You could have a scenario where, yes, the cost of goods no different than, I don't know, my dad when he was growing up. You're buying a loaf of bread for a nickel type of type of situation, right?
Yeah.
As opposed to now we spend, I don't know, you can probably spend upwards of like $7 if you really wanted to on a loaf of
Yeah.
bread, maybe even more. As
If
crazy
you
as
want
that
the
sounds,
fancy stuff, yeah, it's
yeah,
not
right.
hard. Yeah.
Not that that's the normal, but you know that that exists.
Exactly.
You can start to re-justify the amount of inflation, if that makes sense, where it's not actually inflation on your wallet because you have more money. So if
It's
something
inflation in
that
the
used to
system.
cost
Yeah.
$5 now costs $10, but you have double the money in your pocket, well, your purchasing power does not, like, hasn't been affected.
Affected.
Yes, you're putting
Yeah.
more money down to that employer or that business, sorry.
But you
Um,
should have more saved up, anyways.
but
Yeah.
you still left the grocery store with the exact same amount of groceries, right?
Exactly.
So there is like kind of a weird thing with that where you have to decide what's the way that you're going to do it. The the one scenario where you use austerity measures are, obviously, it's a lot of pain in the beginning, but the hope is that you kind of come out of it better, right?
Yeah.
Um it's the equivalent of like, I need to lose weight, so I'm going to starve myself, right?
Yeah.
Um so you have that scenario. But then you could also have a situation where you're going to put a lot of money into the system and hopefully be better off for it after the fact. But
Down the road.
that is ultimately super risky, right? Because if you don't do it properly, right? Like, I
Yeah.
think, I mean, I'm not trying to like, I have the great idea, but but obviously from a tax rebate standpoint, you are very specific of what you're giving that money to, right?
Yeah.
Rather than in the pandemic, when if you were off work and someone gave you $2,000, like the government gave you $2,000, you could spend that on whatever, right? Like, who's to say how much you had saved up, type of thing? Maybe you took
Yeah.
a vacation in another
Yeah.
country, or I don't know what, right? Like, um, there was no control. Ideally, it was going towards your basic necessities, right, to keep you
Yeah.
going, because it's not a lot of money. But there's nothing to say that you couldn't have had a situation. I don't know, maybe you're living with your parents, and so that $2,000 was basically profit, right?
Yeah.
Because your job was relatively profit. Um,
Or you're paying off a loan that's separate
yeah,
to something
right. Like,
else
so
that
you could
occurred,
have
right?
different
Yeah.
scenarios, right? You could have some people that desperately needed that and they had to put that money towards like a loan or something like that. But then you have other people that a lot of the money went into the stock market, right? That's why we
Yeah.
saw crazy growths over the last
Yeah.
few years within the
Yeah,
stock
because we
market.
were joking about that the other day too, is the GameStop and like the meme
Yeah,
stocks.
yeah, meme stocks,
Yeah.
which is wild when you're like, the economy was on hold, so like globally. So you're telling me that we are increasing our economy in a scenario where there is no
Can't
activity happening, right?
exactly. Yeah, it's kind of
Yeah. Um and that's really what, like, the argument would be that in the situation with the pandemic, we should have gone into a recession March 2020,
20. Yeah.
right?
But they
Like,
bought
but they
yeah.
said, nope, we're going to artificially inflate, like, kind of give the economy a life raft and
Yeah.
hope the
Pretend it's
air in it,
alive. Yeah.
yeah, like, keeps us afloat long enough, even though it's like, no, we have weights on our ankles that are pulling us
Yeah.
down.
Yeah.
So
It's like
we
having a kid with a dead pet that they don't realize is dead. It's
yeah, 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 oh my gosh, that's good. But yeah, it's a good analogy, right?
thank
Like,
you, analogy. I was like,
yeah,
there's the
what's the
word.
word, right? Yeah. But no, that is a good analogy, and it is so important that fragility of the system, right? How you're going to approach each problem. Because it's not only like you have the government side of things, but you also have us as individuals.
The free market as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that free market, as private citizens trying to spend our money on the things that we want to spend it on. Well, the system is so fragile that, like, if all the pieces aren't moving in unison, like kind of an understanding what the objective of the other is, uh, you easily can run into a situation where you have a bad situation and just make it worse.
Worse, yeah.
Right?
Which I think that's a good thing to take away. It's just how fragile it is. Like, you can slip from like the recession into the depression very quickly.
Yeah, and because
or just
that
like
artificial way of propping
it
up makes it feel like we're better than we are. But the argument is because we don't just allow ourselves to sink, right? We almost, when if you have a situation where you've lied about something, but then someone tries to catch you on it, and then you make another lie up to try to justify it, and then you just kind of keep going with it.
End up in a web of your own bullshit.
Yeah. I feel like that's what essentially what we're somewhat dealing with, where we're kind of lying to ourselves, right? Like, if you look at 2008 and we bailed out banks, well, those banks should have failed and we should have kind of crumbled as an economy and like learned our lesson from it, right? Like, you look at any of the scenarios, right? Like, I'm not trying to pick on that, but I think that's a very well-known scenario, because for the vast majority of people that are alive today, they lived through that. So even if you were a little kid, right, you maybe knew your parents were kind of money was tight and that type of thing.
Exactly.
But yeah, like, for quite a long time now, right? For multitude of different reasons, right? The ending of the Glass-Steagall Act, printing of money during the pandemic, the wars, right? Go through the different things that affect economies.
Boomers retiring. There's a lot of factors.
Yeah. Right. Like, we're not even going to try to go through every single thing. Insert your answer there of what different factors cause this. But yeah, and I think it's very telling that we likely should be heading into an inflationary recession, because that is a situation where it's like we've overinflated the economy, and now we're going to like kind of deal with the bursting of the bubble, right? Whereas typically you might have an inflating of a certain industry,
correct,
that then pops,
Yeah.
And then you're like, okay, well, farming is still okay over here, but this retail stuff over here is not doing too well, or whatever, right? Like, the tech industry,
a little easier that way, though, where it's
right, as opposed to right now,
it's right across the board.
Yeah, you don't have a choice no matter what it is. Like, there is very few things. If you want to buy farming equipment, you want to buy microchips, you want to buy whatever, right? Like, anything that you buy on a daily basis, you want to go for fast food at lunch, right? Everything is going up in price. Therefore, you're able to purchase a lot less, and therefore your GDP is going to inevitably come crashing down, because you can't justify any of those purchases anymore, right?
Exactly.
Or you're justifying it. Maybe you're still going out for food, but you're only going out once when you used to go out 5 times a week, right? Like, whatever it may be. And it is a weird thing, because you could make the argument of like, yeah, we've overspent, so now we should kind of tighten our wallets and have a situation where we're not spending as much. But I've kind of talked about this in the inflation episode, I believe, in particular. But even in this case of recessions and depressions and things of that, like economic, like economy downturns, it's the people at the bottom and the middle class that feel the effects the most, right? So sure, even the wealthy are going to be spending less, right? Because obviously wealthy people make up a large part of the GDP and economy, because they're spending on things. But when it becomes a numbers game, right? If you have whatever millions of people that make up the lower and middle class of the economy versus maybe you have thousands of people that make up the kind of upper echelons of the wealthy. Well, you can only buy so many things as an individual person, right? You're only going to eat so many meals in a day. You're only going to buy so many things. And so you have a situation where the middle class and the lower class get hit the hardest and have to recover the furthest to be able to get the economy back on track.
Which I'm sure to most people listening is not news.
No, not at all.
Because that falls into the majority of us.
Yeah. And then you run into the situation of like, you also have where you and I might stop our spending, but as kind of the supply and demand issue, I don't want to say starts to resolve itself, but essentially like prices start to come down. Well, that's when, like as demand really plummets, that's when very wealthy people also will jump in and purchase, right? Because you're buying things, relatively speaking, at a discount, right? A great example is like the housing market in Florida back in 2008, right? When it crashed, houses were essentially like might as well have been free for that matter. They weren't, but like, you know what I mean? Like relatively speaking. And then within a couple years, you were making $1 million profit on things that like you bought for next to nothing, like pennies to the dollar.
Which right? we did tell people to go watch Big Short, so we don't want to spoil too much of it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, really, should you be? No one should be surprised about the Big Short. We like most of us lived through it, but I guess there could be some youngins that are
I was gonna say
new to all that, right?
I was talking to somebody about that the other day. I was like, oh my god, that guys were like, it was some sports. Somebody got signed. You're like 20 years old. You're like, oh my god, he wasn't even alive when 9/11 happened.
Yeah, that is
So yeah, 20 years old. Can you listen to this? You're only 7 years old when the first recession happened, so I doubt you'd remember it because I barely remember what was going on when I was 7. I think Princess Diana died.
Yeah. When we were 7,
yeah, 7 or 8 or something like that.
Well, especially you don't. That's not in your wheelhouse. You're not watching
it's
the
not
news.
You're
not.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, unless you have a kind of 9/11, like this is the like biggest news in the past. I don't know how many years. Yeah, you're probably not going to know what's happening with the economy or happening with this election or anything like that. But it just kind of hits home how, like you already said, and like I said, that the fragility, how fragile our economic system really is, and what that means for us kind of going forward, right? Because it's, again, I don't want to get into this, but that conflict, so to speak, of like the government wants one thing, individuals want another thing. They might agree, but they don't agree how to go about it, right? Like it's all those layers where we're dealing with an issue that for the vast majority of us was not our problem, right? And you can make that argument of any recession, any depression, right? But it's even more so in some ways where it's like, well, if I gave you money, you didn't tell me not to spend it, right?
Exactly.
Like you obviously gave that money to me to put into the economy, right? And
the money comes from tax revenue. A lot of, rightfully so, it is your money.
Yeah, right.
It's not the government's money.
Yeah, right.
It's yours, and it's ours. It's mine. It's yours. It's not theirs.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And that's when you have that combination with an economy that physically, like the actual producing of products, is not actually doing that, right? Like which happened in 2020 in particular.
Yeah.
Not to mention just like in Canada, but globally. You're asking for it to be like a rude awakening, right? Where that's going to be a large issue. Where we can't really afford to do all those things. You good on your end?
Yeah, just thought my water was closer than it was.
Oh, no worries. No worries. I was worried that something, because my camera has literally been out now for the last little bit. So you're hearing my voice, but not seeing me. But if you're watching this on Spotify or whatever, any Apple,
you
all those podcast things, you don't have the video anyway, so it doesn't really matter. This is all good. But yeah, I don't know if it, I you know me, I have a tendency to ramble and all that kind of stuff. So I don't want to go too crazy into things, but I don't know if you have other kind of points that you want to focus on or
No, I
anything
think
like
what I
that, or
said earlier
reiterate.
is in terms of the context today is it's the three main: shelter, food, and transportation, right? So you keep an eye on those indicators, and the more it goes up, right? And
Mm-hmm.
if you're not making more money, then you can assume that the economy is not going to be in the greatest of shapes, even if they're saying that it doesn't look like we're going to be in that position at the moment.
Yeah, 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 and yeah, I think that in including this element of inflation that we're kind of dealing with right now,
Yep.
where it's not like the water or whatever transportation or all these things aren't available. It's that they're not available at the current costs that they're kind of at, right? Like
Should be at, yeah.
the yeah, like
They're
you
inflated
can't
over their
find a
actual
house
value.
to live in because they're too expensive. You can't
Yeah.
get transportation because it's more expensive than you can justify. You can't have a full grocery order because you're the cost of, I don't know,
Exactly. But those are the
chicken is more.
basic indicators, right? That you
Yeah,
want to,
right. Like when
yeah.
your lifestyle is drastically changing, or changing at all, in a negative way, well, that's really the economy. Unless your job, obviously, if you, I don't know, became unemployed or got a job that pays less, then sure, those
Yeah.
lifestyle things will happen. But if a lot of people are also falling into that, where it's like, oh,
Then
I
it's
used to
different.
work
Yeah.
this job, but now I have to work this job, or I'm unemployed, those are the like indicators
Yeah.
that are really kind of hitting home about recessions and depressions, and the degree to that is what really determines things. um,
Yeah. No, I think those are the main
but yeah,
indicators, but that's, I think, more than enough for one afternoon anyways on recessions. It gets a little bit
perfect.
sad. Yeah.
Yeah, hopefully everyone kind of gets, yeah, the nuances of our current situation, which is kind of building upon a lot of things that we've already talked about. But it hopefully, if you're watching this in the future, hopefully it's not as bad as people
Where it is right
are
now as
yeah,
during
that's
this
right
episode.
now,
Yeah.
or that potentially it could be. But I guess more importantly, hopefully there's enough of a safety net, like, because we should fall, as bad as that sounds. The economy is inflated in a lot of ways. It's just hopefully the powers that be are smart about how they're going to go about dealing with that.
Exactly.
But I think on that note, like Jordan said, hopefully you've learned something. Hopefully you can take some stuff away from this episode. But yeah, that's our episode on recessions and depressions and all that. And as always, he's Jordan. I'm Braden. Together we are the Realist Idealists. And this is Powerview.